to our little family gathering. Uncle David Levine is here today at my invitation, and I'm so pleased that he's here to tell us a little bit about our roots. Many times my children have said, please tell us about our ancestors, and most of the answers that I've gotten have been from Uncle Dave, and since I haven't been very good at writing them down or repeating them, I thought it would be wonderful to record this information and have it for my many cousins, of whom there are 15, their children, of whom there are 38, and at this point there are 6 great-grandchildren, with many more to come, I'm sure. It's for these 4th and 5th generations of progeny of Joseph and Dina Galembo Levine, who came to this country in 1905 and produced all these wonderful people, Levine people, that we want to put this on record. And so, Uncle Dave, thank you so much for coming, and we're going to try and find out all kinds of things from you today.
I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to your lovely home, and always a pleasure to meet with you and your wonderful children.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to see Adam. He's grown up to be a tall, handsome young man, and I'm sure he's going to be a very successful lawyer, as is his father, and reach the heights. My best wishes, Adam. We have been blessed with a wonderful set of parents. My father, blessed memory, Reverend Joseph Levine, was born in the very important city in Russia called Minsk, M-I-N-S-K. It contained a very large, affluent, and very important Jewish community. Many great institutions of learning. My father's family were quite an illustrious family and had many branches. One of the most famous branches of the family, which may be of interest to you, was the Polakov family. An uncle of my father, I should say probably a great uncle. This Polakov was an engineer, and he was the one who was in charge of the construction of all the railroads in Russia, and resided in the capital city, and was befriended by all the authorities. And he provided for every one of the boys from his family, if they wanted to go to university or college, he would provide for that. A few accepted, because to become involved in higher education in Russia at that time meant practically conversion. So that my father, who was also invited, never accepted. He, as a young lad, like boys of today, went to a yeshiva. In those days, all boys went to a yeshiva, and he was sent to a very famous yeshiva called Volozhin, V-O-L-O-Z-H-I-N. It produced some of the greatest scholars and cultural leaders in the world Jewish community. The great Soloveitchik family of the current Rabbi Soloveitchik, who is considered the greatest living authority, Talmudic authority, is a great-great-grandson of the leadership of this yeshiva. One of the family that was presiding at the time as the Rosh HaYeshiva, when my father studied there, was Rabbi Berlin, the father of the Rabbi Berlin, in whose honor the Bar Ilan University was established in Israel. My father, after completing his studies in Volozhin Yeshiva, went on to the city of Vilna. Vilna at that time was considered for a century the Jerusalem of Eastern Europe. It was a city of great learning and scholarship. And my father was retained to be the director of studies in the Hebrew Institute in Vilna. And it was during this period that he met my mother. My mother was a very beautiful, charming young lady, the only daughter of a Mr. Israel Golembo and his lovely wife, who was in business. He was a merchant. He had a merchandising store, and he also had substantial real estate holdings. And so my mother was considerably in demand. And being a very pretty girl, she had many sweethearts. Somehow or other, my father succeeded as a scholar to attract the interests of both parents and won her hand. They were engaged, I think it was about 1894, and they were married in 1895 in Vilna. All of the great personalities in Vilna attended the ceremony. And as a matter of fact, the chief rabbi of Vilna was the one who was the syndic at your father's bris. And he was a very close friend of the family. In 1904, all of us 6 children were either born or conceived. Albert was just about conceived. My father was invited to give up the position of director of Hebrew Studies at the Institute and to take a pulpit as rabbi in East Russia, near the vicinity of Tiflis, north of the Caspian, where there was a great need for rabbinical leadership and for teachers. Most of the scholarship and leadership was in the East, and not too many wanted to go out into the, was rather, I should say, in the western part of Russia. Not many of them want to go on to the eastern areas, which were less populated and less Jews. He accepted the invitation, and he was traveling by official programming to be interviewed by his congregants, possible congregants. And as he was traveling through all this vast country, he realized and recognized that the country was not in a very peaceful status. In 1904 was a disastrous year of the Russian-Japanese War, which the Russians lost. They conscripted every available man, and Jewish boys were forcibly taken from their families at the young age of 11 and 12 for a 25-year servitude in the army. He saw all of this taking place as he traveled to the eastern areas, decided that this was not the place where he wants to raise his family. And he went back to Vilna, and he said to the rabbinate authorities, "This is not the place where I want to be with my children. I am taking my children to America." He resigned.
It wasn't. It didn't have anything to do with persecution at that time, or bad conditions in the ghetto that led so many Jewish people to come to the United States.
During that period, following the historically recognized atrocities of the Kishinev pogroms, which began some years prior thereto, conditions were very difficult for Jews in the outlying areas. The restrictions then prevailing on Jews was they would not be permitted to have a higher education unless they gave up Judaism. They were restricted in many other ways. Representations were made to Russia by Teddy Roosevelt and by the American government, so that Russia was not the power it became some years later, but it was still a very great power, vast land. And because of the persecutions that were prevalent from the late 1800s, the migration to the United States and to other parts of the world, but primarily the States, grew with each decade. So that the influx in the United States began probably around 1850-60. By 1890, there was a considerable colony in America of Jewish people, mostly from Germany and Austria, who were smart enough to escape and who established themselves in this country. And they were the people who received the influx when they came from Eastern Europe. But the German early settlers here were not very happy about the influx of these poor that came, as Emma Lazarus described.
Right.
And so they exploited them. That was the situation that existed in Russia. It was not the kind of place that my father felt he could raise his children. America was considered to be a land of gold was in the streets, but on the other hand, from a Jewish cultural point of view, it was considered a place where you could lose your Judaism. And so the authorities in Eastern Europe tried to dissuade anybody from going to the United States, or for that matter to go to Western Europe. But most of them did in any event. My father, having an official passport, an official status, had no difficulty in arranging for his transportation and travel to the United States, or for his family to follow him when he was ready. And that is what he did. He had many adventures on the way, because it was a matter of 3 to 6 weeks
Crossing.
And to get to a port and wherever the ports of ships were living, many of them from Riga or other European ports. Well, father reached the United States sometimes around early 1905, and his first position was not in New York, where he landed and where he was invited to enter the rabbinate. My father, your grandfather, was a very principled and dedicated man. He was a teacher. And he felt that there were so many towns outside of New York who could only afford one man who had to be the rabbi and the teacher and the cantor and the mole and the shochet and the friend in times of joy and in times of sorrow. And he felt that was his calling. So his first position that he accepted was a small town in Connecticut, Willimantic, a very beautiful town, still extant. He was there about a year, and he felt that he had adjusted himself to the United States, that he knew what he wanted to do.
Did he have a difficulty learning English? Did he have any preparation before he came?
He did not have any preparation to my knowledge. He might have, but he doesn't seem to have had any difficulty. He was quite a student. He took the languages. The community of Willimantic wanted him to stay on, but he felt that it was not a well-established community where he could raise his children, and he expected a sixth child whom he had not yet met or seen, so that he would look for another position. And he was invited to become the rabbi and the kol bo, the one who would provide all requirements for a town of Donora, a suburb of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. He accepted that pulpit and responsibilities.
That was a mining town, wasn't it?
No, at that time, it was a beautiful residential suburb of Pittsburgh.
It became a mining town.
I'll tell you what it became.
A mill town.
It became a mill town and a strip mine town and a horrible place. To divert for a moment, we were in Donora from early 1906 till about 1913 13, late 1912-13, when my father moved on to his next pulpit. It was a beautiful town, beautiful little station, all along the Mongol Hill River for several miles. It was a magnificent park. The school was a beautiful little schoolhouse in an area of about 4 acres, and all around the grounds of the school were the trees we would planted by the children on Arbor Day. And it was a lovely town with a little suburb residential town. We left Donora for Glace Bay, Nova Scotia around January of 1913. November, December 1912, my father accepted a position in Glace Bay. And it wasn't until about 1940, in the 40s, that I had a case that came up, brought me to Pittsburgh in behalf of some of these crane manufacturers whom I represented at that time. And being so close to Donora, I said to the gentleman, who was my client in the matter, that I would like to drive to Donora and see it.
You were in for a rude awakening.
He urged me not to go. I insisted. What a letdown. Instead of park all along the river, there were steel mills belching smoke. All the nice parts of the town was torn by strip mining, and they left hills which were never straightened out. I did find the station. It was an oasis surrounded by hills from the strip mining. A beautiful little station. I did find the synagogue that my father built. I imagine that synagogue was a tremendous building. It was a little house about 20 by 60, 2.5 stories, brick. A beautiful little structure with all the facilities, but enough to accommodate a community of about 100 people. And so it was miniature. When I walked in there, I couldn't imagine. This was a big synagogue. I remember it as a child. It was a disillusionment. I never went back to any other town I'd been to where I lived.
You can't go home again.
I didn't go there again. Coming back to the story, we all went to school in Donora. We continued in Glace Bay. And in Glace Bay, we were there from about 1913 to about 1918. And as we grew up, my father wanted to have the facilities of a larger community. And he next accepted a pulpit in St. John, New Brunswick, which was a substantially larger city with a very fine Jewish community of several hundred families, a very fine facilities and institutions. And we were in St. John through to 1922. In 1922, we moved to Albany, and I was the reason. My brother Isidore, who was your father, he was the most brilliant student in Glace Bay High School. He took every prize. His marks, I'm talking about the top being 100%, he was about 101 on every subject. Nobody had a chance. He was utterly brilliant. And it was decided that he should go to college and get a BA degree and either go into teaching or possibly accounting or business administration. He selected Albany because in Albany we had cousins of my mother.
The Smith family, yes?
Oh, the Koblenz family. The Koblenz family. The mother of the Koblentzes was a Bela Koblenz. We called her Muma Bela, or Aunt Bela. She was the daughter of Israel Galembo from the first marriage. And there was perhaps 15 years difference in age. It had been my mother, who was the only child of the second marriage. And she migrated after she married Mr. Koblenz and settled in Albany. And the Koblenz family were very active in the Orthodox community of Albany. They were very happy to have a visitor come there, and he entered the State University, where he finished with high honors. He resisted, shall I say, a liberalization of his practices, religiously speaking, for several years. And he came back to St. John, but it was very difficult for a young fellow. When he left Glace Bay, because of his brilliance, he finished high school very early. He was all of 16. And 16, 17, and 18, he resisted, but how much resistance could there be? The Koblenz family were affiliated, active with the Orthodox congregation, but they were a little bit liberal in their practices. And in school, the students of the Jewish background were all from liberal families. Those who went to college in those days were prepared to be very liberal and gave up much in order to try to assimilate. So that while he was influenced by this association and of with his peers, he was always deeply attached to his tradition. He enjoyed reading a muftir at services in the synagogue, and he became very directively involved in the Zionist movement. It was long before the days of UJA and Bond Drive. Zionism were in its very early days. It was long before the establishment of the State of Israel, long before we even talked about the establishment of the State of Israel. It was a hope, and he was very active, directively active, and very effective too, very capable man. So that when it came my time to go into a professional course, I had finished high school in St. John, and I had attended the New Brunswick University, and I'd gotten my associate degree. At that particular time, in 1922, admission to law and medicine was a high school degree. Admission to pharmacy was 2 years of high school. And some pharmacy and some other such courses accepted them from public school. It wasn't until 1922 that they began to raise the requirements. 1922 was the last year for high school requirements for medicine and for law. And the last year for 2 years high school for pharmacy. As a result, there was a tremendous influx of students, and the Albany Medical School, where I matriculated and was accepted, and who were going to give me special labs so I don't have to attend labs on Saturday, found themselves with 3 sessions instead of 1. So the student body grew. And they offered me the privilege of attending but not writing, and I declined. And that's how I transferred to law, the law division of the university. The medical school and the law school were all divisions of Union University. And so it was easy for me to transfer, and I transferred to law primarily because the then Newton Firo assured me that even though all tests and exams and proceedings were on Sabbath, I would get the same things attended for me on Sundays, which he did. So I entered law, but that is the reason why we went to Albany. We had family there, Isidore was there, and my father gave up his pulpit in St. John and took a lesser commitment in Albany, because there were already rabbis established in the various synagogues, because he did not want his children to sway, and he hoped that by being in Albany, Isidore might be sort of induced to return a bit. So we moved to Albany. It was in Albany that I graduated law and practiced there for a while.
And Albert?
Albert was then in high school. He was in high school in
And then he
Albany.
eventually went to law school also in Albany?
Eventually he studied law. He has his degree from the University of Chicago. He joined me in New York. I opened my offices in Albany in 1926. January 1929, I moved my offices and opened my offices in New York City. Albert joined me in New York around 1932. He was married in 35, and he became a member of the firm. It became Levine and Levine.
Now tell us something about the sisters, 3 Levine sisters.
Emma, the number 1 child, and my older sister, may she rest in peace, met her mate in St. John. The Garson family were one of the director families in the community. And she met and married, and Frank wooed her, and they were married in St. John. And their first child, River, was born in St. John.
I never knew that.
I think that they were married probably in 1921, about a year before we moved. And River was born in 1922. The Garsons, I think, remained in St. John until about 1930 or 31, when they moved to Albany. Sally and Helen, they moved with us to Albany, and they became trained secretaries. They had already graduated high school in St. John prior to me, and were already working as secretaries in St. John. And within a period of years, they met their mates and were married. Isidore was married first, I think 1926.
25.
24, 25.
Oh, 24, you're right.
24.
I should know that.
And Helen was married late that year in 24, and Sally was married in 26. My father, after the children were married, remained in Albany. He then had an invitation to become the one man in Amsterdam, New York, and he took the position there, where he was the rabbi, teacher, cantor, mohel, and shochet. A very small but lovely town. Sally lived in Schenectady. Isidore lived in Albany. So that they had 2 of the children there and grandchildren, and were very happy there. It was about 1934 that I induced my father to retire and come to New York. And Mr. Rabbi and Mrs. Levine came to New York and took residence in Bensonhurst. Albert was married in 35, and though I was left as a bachelor, doing very well as a lawyer, it was of interest to them to be married. And I did meet Cecile after the holidays in 1934, and in June of 1935 we were engaged, and in September we were married. And shortly after the marriage, my father went back to Amsterdam. He didn't want to retire. And they were there in Amsterdam another 2 or 3 years, but the winters were hard. He was getting on. So that about 1937 or 8, I again was able to get my father to retire. This time he moved to Kew Gardens, close to where we were. We were living in Gardens. We had our home there, and Elaine was already there, and then the others arrived. I was very active in the community. I was the founding president of the Kew Gardens Synagogue. I was active in the various national organizations, all of which were a source of joy to my father. And he and my mother had very good years, thank God. He was taken in 1947. He was then 77. And in 1950, mother was taken. She was 79. That brings us up to the situation. Now, what questions would you like to ask?
Well, I think you've covered the family history very thoroughly. You brought along a few artifacts that might be interesting. I think the shofar is particularly interesting, and I would love to hear you blow it for us. I don't know, do you have to warm up, or can you just do it? And tell us about the two different ones you brought.
This shofar was my father's shofar, and he blew this at the High Holy Days. From the time he arrived in this country until his demise. It's a very nice little shofar. It has a high tone. It's a bit worn at the lip so that you don't get the full force anymore. I can blow it, but not as good as he did. In 1939...
Oh, let me interrupt you 1 second. You once said to me that he had a very nice singing voice. Is that right?
Yes, he was a magnificent Ba'al Tefillah, means one who conducts prayer. A Ba'al Tefillah is a cantor who does praying in a very beautiful, traditional, melodious tones and melodies that are traditional, without getting involved in operatic or cantorial renditions of an operatic type, which would be the indulgence of a cantor. So that a Ba'al Tefillah who had a beautiful voice and who knew these beautiful traditional melodies was much sought after. And he had a magnificent voice, and he was a magnificent Ba'al Tefillah. My father was also a marvelous orator in Yiddish, in English to a considerable extent, and in Hebrew. In Yiddish, he was a spellbinder. And some of the narratives that he used to use to create emotional reaction, I have borrowed from him and I've used.
It's too bad we didn't have videotape to record him.
I became involved in participating in the services in 1939 because having moved to Kew Gardens in 38, by 1939 we organized our own congregation. We were too young a congregation to afford retaining people, so it was all voluntary. So another gentleman who had a very good voice and had the son of a cantor, and I directed the service. My father tutored me, and so did this other gentleman. And so I participated in the High Holiday service, in the Sabbath services. When the High Holidays came in 1939, it was up to me to blow shofar.
I think at that point
so my father,
you should do it.
My father went with me downtown and he decided to get me a chauffeur. And it's an interesting incident because the bookstore, who had 100 chauffeurs, gave us a box of chauffeurs to try them out. We started blowing one after the other, so they asked us to go into the private office. And we selected my chauffeur, which I've been using ever since. So I'll try to blow my father's chauffeur. It's a bit of an art, but it's very similar to blowing a trumpet.
Pursing your lips.
You don't blow with your full lips. You purse it so that you can blow into it and direct the volume. That's exactly like a trumpet. And most people who try to blow a shofar try to blow as if it were just something to blow into, like a tune, and they struggle. They might get some tone, but they struggle. But once you get to know how to blow it like a trumpet, it's not at all difficult. So this is my father's shofar. The reason for the 4 different annotations is that the blowing of the shofar involves first a long call, sort of a call to duty, a call of awareness to pray. That's one long tone. And then there is one that's a triple tone. That's a sort of an alarm. You've got to be a little bit more cautious, and that would be like 2, 2, 2. And the length of these three has to be the same length as the one. And then there is the real alarm. So there's Truah, and then the Shvarim, which is broken, that's 3. And there's Teruah, that Tkiya is the one tone, the long tone. Shvarim is the broken tone. And Truah is the alarm, and that has 9 digits. Each of the 3 of the digits are equal to 1/3, one of the broken one, and all 9 have to be the same length of the single tekiah. But the one that the shofar that my father helped me select is a little bit more of a bass tone, and it was easier for me. You find a shofar that's easy for you. So I'll give you an example of this. Then you blow the shvar, that's 3. Then you blow the truah, that's 9. And then you blow, followed by a final tekiah. And the ritual at the services in the temple, Reform, Conservative, and in the synagogue, is all the same. They follow the same ritual going back to Mosaic times, because they heard all these signals, was part of the signal. But on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, we sort of call the people to dedicate themselves. And we start blowing the shofar 1 month before Rosh Hashanah. It's blown every morning. The month of Elul, which precedes the month of Tishrei, when Rosh Hashanah is the first of Tishrei, will begin in about 2 weeks. So on Sunday, 2 weeks from now, a week from this coming Sunday, we're going to start blowing shofar every day, excepting Sabbath.
How about you? Will you be blowing it?
I will be blowing it. I participate in the services. Ever since 1939, I participate in the High Holy Day services, and I blow shofar.
Wonderful. Now you also brought us a cup, which maybe you'd like to tell us about, and maybe we can have a drink of wine with the cups. Uncle Dave, you're a wonderful guest. Not only did you bring some artifacts, as I requested, you brought some cups that I'd like you to tell us about, but you also brought Israeli wine to drink in the cups. So may I pour?
Please do.
I'm going to pour a little wine for us, especially you. You probably need to quench your thirst after giving all that wonderful information. So let's have a little sip.
This being a special occasion, I'll recite the blessing on wine.
Oh, that's very nice.
And we should be blessed with a good health, a good year, and good fortune. You should have much joy from your children and wonderful children, and eventually grandchildren too.
And to you.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pri hagafen. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe. Give us of the fruit of the vine. This cup, Melba, is a cup that your grandfather, my father, was presented by my mother's parents as a gift on their wedding day. It's a very beautiful silver, sterling silver, pure silver cup, traditional design. And this has been his wine cup with which he greeted the Sabbath and the high holy days and all holidays and every happy occasion, including the marriage of your father and mother.
Isn't that a wonderful, wonderful thing to have?
This cup is one of our collection, but I brought another cup along so that you would participate with me in this toast.
Thank you, and this wine is lovely, really lovely.
Yes, a nice wine. Good luck to you, Adam.
You brought a number of things along, but there's one in particular that I think is really so interesting. A perpetual calendar that dates back to 1904, and it was owned by my grandfather, your father, and I think maybe we can pick up some of the printed cover. This comes from Vilna.
Vilna.
And what's really interesting is that my grandfather, Joseph Levine, began recording the dates of importance in the family, the births and the marriages, and then the subsequent births of all the children right up to his demise. And they're all listed here in his handwriting, written in Hebrew, listing all of us. I can see the years. I can make that out upside down. 1907, 1908, etc. And this is a wonderful memento to have also and to preserve. And what we'll do, rather than have all of the names of all of the family called out, I think that we'll try and do a nice family tree that will record all the people in the wonderful Levine family.
And any information you need, I'll be glad to supply if I can.
Well, I'll need your help once again. And I think we should say a wonderful toast to the Levine family, L'chaim,
L'chaim.
and thank you so much.
And thank you for calling me. It's been a pleasure to participate in this recording for the purposes you so wonderfully planned and programmed.